April 8, 1945, somewhere over Bavaria, 11,000 feet. The compass needle drifted lazily in its liquid housing, spinning without purpose, without north. Second Lieutenant James Howell watched it through the scratched glass of his instrument panel, his gloved hand resting on the control column of his P-51 Mustang as the aircraft droned eastward through air so clear it seemed the sky had been washed clean. Below, the Bavarian countryside unrolled in shades of green and brown, forests thick with pine, fields still muddy from the spring thaw, and roads that stitched the landscape together in thin ribbons of gray. The sunlight came hard through the canopy, bright enough to make him squint, warm enough to cut through the cold at altitude. His radio crackled with static, and the occasional transmission from his squadron, now somewhere far behind him, their voices distant and tinny. He was alone, not by choice but by circumstance, by the slow mechanical failure of a device no bigger than a pocket watch, spinning uselessly in its mount, offering no guidance, no certainty, no way home. He did not panic. Panic was a luxury reserved for men who had not yet learned that fear, in the cockpit of a fighter aircraft over enemy territory, was simply another instrument to be read and ignored. Howell had been flying combat missions for 7 months, long enough to understand that navigation was less about knowing where you were and more about knowing where you were not. He checked his fuel gauge, 40 minutes of flight time remaining, perhaps less if he pushed the throttle. He checked the sun's position, tried to remember the briefing map he had studied that morning before takeoff, the pencil lines marking safe corridors and flak zones, and the uncertain geography of a country that was collapsing but had not yet surrendered. Somewhere to the west was the Allied front. Somewhere below was Bavaria, and Bavaria was still Germany, still hostile, still capable of killing a man who landed in the wrong field. He banked the Mustang gently, searching for landmarks, a river, a town, anything that might orient him in the featureless expanse of enemy territory. And that was when he saw it. A straight line cutting through the forest, too geometric to be natural, too long to be a logging road. He descended, dropping to 8,000 feet, then 6, his eyes narrowing as the details resolved. The line was a runway, paved and wide, flanked by revetments and hangars that had been camouflaged with netting and painted canvas to blend into the surrounding woods. And parked along the taxiways, lined up like toys in a child's collection, were aircraft, dozens of them, their shapes unmistakable even from altitude. Messerschmitt 109s, Focke-Wulf 190s, a handful of twin-engine bombers, and something else, something he had only seen in intelligence photographs. Sleek, needle-nosed fighters with swept wings and no propellers, their fuselages painted in the mottled greens and grays of late-war Luftwaffe camouflage. Jets. Howell's thumb moved instinctively to the radio switch, and he began to transmit coordinates he did not fully trust, describing what he saw in the clipped, professional language of a combat pilot who had just stumbled into something far larger than a navigational error. What he did not know, what he could not have known, circling above that hidden airfield in the dying light of an April afternoon, was that his broken compass had led him to one of the Luftwaffe's last operational jet bases, a secret facility that Allied intelligence had been hunting for months, and that the information he was about to relay would set in motion a series of strikes that would help cripple Germany's final desperate bid to contest the skies over its own territory. He did not know that his mistake would become, in the chaotic mathematics of war, a kind of accidental precision. He knew only that his compass was broken, that he was lost, and that below him lay a target too valuable to ignore. The war had taught him that sometimes survival and victory were separated by nothing more than a moment of clarity in the midst of confusion. This was such a moment. And the clarity came not from skill or planning, but from the random failure of a small metal device, spinning uselessly in its casing, pointing nowhere and everywhere at once. By the spring of 1945, the air war over Germany had long since ceased to be a contest of equals. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, had been ground down by attrition, fuel shortages, and the relentless arithmetic of Allied production. At the start of the war, German pilots had flown the most advanced fighters in the world, aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 that combined speed, maneuverability, and firepower in a package that dominated the skies over Poland, France, and the Low Countries. But by 1945, the equation had shifted. The United States Army Air Forces alone were fielding over 15,000 combat aircraft in the European theater, supported by an industrial base that could replace losses faster than they occurred. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, was down to fewer than 2,000 operational fighters, most of them flown by pilots with minimal training, burning fuel that had to be synthesized from coal because the oil fields of Romania were lost and the refineries of the Ruhr were under constant bombardment. The German High Command understood that conventional fighters could no longer turn the tide. What they needed was not more Bf-109s or FW-190s, but a technological leap, a weapon so superior that it could compensate for numerical inferiority through sheer performance. That weapon was the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. With a top speed of 540 miles per hour, it was nearly 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied propeller-driven aircraft. Its four 30mm cannons could shred a bomber formation in seconds, and its swept-wing design, revolutionary for its time, gave it handling characteristics that no piston engine fighter could match at high altitude. In the hands of a skilled pilot, the Me-262 was almost untouchable, a glimpse of the future inserted into a war that was still being fought with sword and spears. The technologies of the past. But the Me-262 was also a symbol of Germany's industrial collapse. It required specialized manufacturing facilities, rare metals, and precision engineering that the Reich's war economy could no longer reliably provide. The jet engines, temperamental and prone to failure, had a service life measured in hours rather than months. Pilot training, once rigorous and thorough, had been reduced to bare minimums as experienced instructors were killed faster than they could be replaced. And most critically, the fuel needed to operate jet aircraft was in such short supply that many Me-262s never left the ground, sitting idle on runways while their pilots waited for deliveries that never came. By April 1945, Germany had produced over 1,400 Me-262s, but fewer than 200 were operational at any given time, and those that did fly were often used piecemeal, in small numbers, against targets that required overwhelming force to defend. The Allies knew about the Me-262, and they feared it. Intelligence reports from late 1944 had warned that the jet fighter represented a serious threat to daylight bombing operations, and several encounters over Germany had confirmed those warnings. On November 2, 1944, an M262, piloted by Lieutenant Alfred Schreiber, shot down a P-51 Mustang in a head-on pass that lasted less than 3 seconds. The American pilot never even saw what hit him. On January 14, 1945, a formation of M262s attacked a group of B-17 bombers over Magdeburg, destroying 4 aircraft and damaging 6 more in a single pass before disappearing into the clouds, untouched by the escorting fighters. These incidents, though rare, were enough to convince Allied commanders that the Me-262 had to be neutralized, not in the air, where it held every advantage, but on the ground, where it was as vulnerable as any other aircraft. The problem was finding them. The Luftwaffe had learned through bitter experience that centralized airfields were death traps. Allied fighter bombers, ranging freely over Germany in the wake of the collapse of the Wehrmacht's air defenses, could destroy entire squadrons in a single strafing run. And so the Germans had dispersed their jets, hiding them in camouflaged bases built into forests, in fields disguised to look like farmland, in tunnels carved into hillsides. These facilities were small, difficult to spot from the air, and constantly shifting as the front lines moved closer. Allied reconnaissance aircraft photographed thousands of square miles of German territory, but the Me-262s remained elusive, ghosts in the intelligence reports, appearing only when they struck and then vanishing back into the landscape. It was into this environment that Lieutenant James Howell flew on the morning of April 8, 1945. His mission had been straightforward, a fighter sweep over southern Bavaria, part of a larger effort to suppress remaining Luftwaffe resistance in the region. He had taken off from an airfield near Strasbourg at 0915, joining a formation of 8 P-51 Mustangs from the 357th Fighter Group. The weather was clear, the visibility excellent. The plan was to patrol a corridor between Munich and Regensburg, engaging any enemy aircraft encountered and strafing targets of opportunity on the ground. It was, by the standards of April 1945, a routine mission, the kind that pilots flew without expecting much to happen, because by that point in the war, the Luftwaffe rarely rose to meet them. What was not routine was the compass failure. Howell noticed it 20 minutes into the flight, shortly after crossing the Rhine. The needle, which should have held steady on a northeasterly heading, began to oscillate, drifting in slow circles as if searching for magnetic north and failing to find it. At first, he assumed it was a temporary malfunction, a bubble in the liquid or a loose connection. But as the minutes passed and the needle continued to spin, he realized the instrument was dead. He informed his flight leader over the radio, expecting to be ordered back to base. Instead, he was told to maintain visual contact with the formation and navigate by reference to the other aircraft. This worked well enough until the formation encountered cloud cover over the Danube. Howell, flying on the far right flank, drifted into the clouds and lost sight of his wingman. By the time he emerged into clear air, the rest of the squadron was gone. He climbed, searching the sky for the telltale glint of sunlight on metal, but saw nothing. He called over the radio, received only static in reply. And so he was alone, somewhere over Bavaria, with no compass, limited fuel, and a choice to make. Attempt to navigate back to friendly territory using dead reckoning and hope he did not blunder into a flak battery, or continue eastward, deeper into enemy airspace in the hope of finding a landmark he recognized. He chose the latter, not out of bravery, but out of practicality. Turning west meant flying blind into airspace he could not identify, with no way to confirm he was not crossing into Switzerland or circling back toward the front lines where trigger-happy anti-aircraft gunners would not distinguish between friend and foe. Flying east, at least, kept the sun in the correct position relative to his intended course, and the fuel situation, while not ideal, was not yet desperate. He would fly for another 10 minutes, he decided, and if he saw nothing useful, he would turn west and take his chances. He saw the airfield at the 9-minute mark. The runway appeared first as a line of shadow, darker than the surrounding forest, running straight through a valley that seemed otherwise untouched by war. Howell descended cautiously, his eyes scanning for anti-aircraft positions, but the field appeared undefended, or at least not actively shooting at him. The revetments were visible now, and the aircraft inside them, and the longer he looked, the more details emerged. Ground crews in dark coveralls, moving slowly between the hangars. Fuel trucks parked beneath camouflage netting. And on the far end of the runway, a Me-262 in the process of being towed to a takeoff position, its twin engines' nacelles slung beneath the wings like sleek torpedoes. Howell's training took over. He climbed back to altitude, put the airfield at his 6 o'clock, and began to transmit. His voice was calm, methodical, reciting the details as he saw them, approximate coordinates based on visible terrain features, number and type of aircraft, condition of the runway, presence of defensive positions. He did not know if anyone was listening. The radio had been unreliable all morning, and for all he knew, his transmission was disappearing into static. But he transmitted anyway, because that was what a pilot did when he found something important. He reported it, and he trusted that someone, somewhere, was receiving the information. Someone was. At 11:47, Howell's transmission was picked up by a radio operator at the headquarters of IX Tactical Air Command, stationed near Kaiserslautern. The operator, a corporal from Ohio named William Vance, had been monitoring radio traffic for 6 hours and was half asleep when the signal came through. But the words jet aircraft and camouflaged airfield snapped him awake, and within minutes, the transmission had been relayed to the operations officer, then to the commanding general, then to the bomber and fighter groups that were already airborne over southern Germany. By 12:15, a flight of P-47 Thunderbolts had been diverted from their original mission and were en route to the coordinates Howell had provided. By 1300, those coordinates were being cross-referenced with reconnaissance photographs and signals intelligence, and analysts were confirming what Howell had found: a hidden Luftwaffe jet base, one of the last operational facilities capable of supporting Me-262 operations, a target that had been on the Allied priority list for weeks. Howell, meanwhile, was trying to find his way home. His fuel gauge was now in the red, and the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon. He had no compass, no landmarks he recognized, and no idea whether the transmission had been received. He flew west, hoping that instinct and luck would carry him back to friendly territory. And at 1342, with his fuel gauge reading near empty, he spotted a column of American tanks moving along a road near the town of Landshut. He descended, waggled his wings to signal friendly intent, and followed the road westward until he saw an improvised airstrip carved into a field near Dachau. He landed on fumes, the engine coughing and sputtering as he taxied to a stop, and when he climbed out of the cockpit, his legs were shaking. Not from fear, but from the adrenaline that had kept him alert for the past 4 hours finally draining away. He did not know, as he sat on the wing of his Mustang and smoked a cigarette bummed from a ground crew mechanic, that the airfield he had discovered would be destroyed before nightfall. He did not know that 16 P-47 Thunderbolts were already inbound, their bomb racks loaded with high explosive and incendiary ordnance, or that the Me-262s he had seen would be reduced to twisted metal and shattered glass within the hour. He did not know that his accidental discovery would be written up in intelligence reports, that his commanding officer would recommend him for a commendation, or that historians would later identify his sighting as one of the final blows against the Luftwaffe's jet fighter program. He knew only that his compass was broken, that he had gotten lost, and that somewhere in the process of being lost, he had found something. This was the nature of war in 1945, a collision of intention and accident, of planning and chaos, where a single mechanical failure could lead to strategic success, and where the line between mistake and miracle was often invisible until long after the fact. The strike on the hidden airfield commenced at 14:23. The P-47 Thunderbolts approached from the south, flying low to avoid detection, their radio engines roaring as they descended through the clear afternoon air. The Luftwaffe crews on the ground had no warning. One moment they were refueling a Me-262, preparing it for an evening patrol. The next, the sky was filled with the sound of aircraft and the shriek of bombs falling. The first pass destroyed 3 jets on the ground, their fuel tanks rupturing and igniting in fireballs that sent black smoke boiling into the sky. The second pass hit the fuel depot, and the resulting explosion was visible from 10 miles away, a mushroom cloud of flame and debris that climbed hundreds of feet before collapsing into a pall of smoke that hung over the valley like a shroud. The German crews scrambled to launch the remaining aircraft, but it was too late. The P-47s made a third pass, this time with their .50 caliber machine guns, shredding the parked jets with sustained bursts that tore through aluminum skin and hydraulic lines and cockpit glass. One Me-262 managed to get airborne, its pilot pushing the throttles forward in a desperate attempt to gain altitude. But a Thunderbolt caught it as it climbed, and the jet disintegrated in mid-air, pieces of fuselage tumbling earthward like discarded paper. By the time the attack ended, 7 minutes after it began, the airfield was a ruin. 11 Me-262s destroyed, 4 damaged beyond repair, and the runway cratered to the point of uselessness. The cost to the Allies? 0 aircraft lost, minimal ammunition expended. The after-action report filed by the leader of the P-47 flight, Captain Robert Milliken, noted the efficiency of the strike and credited the success to the accuracy of the intelligence provided by Lieutenant Howell. Target was exactly where described, Milliken wrote, no enemy air opposition, field neutralized with complete success. The report did not mention the broken compass because no one at headquarters knew about it yet. That detail would emerge later in Howell's debriefing, when the intelligence officer asked him how he had managed to find a camouflaged airfield that had eluded reconnaissance efforts for weeks. Howell's answer was characteristically modest. "I got lost, the compass quit working, and I just kept flying east until I saw something worth reporting." The intelligence officer, a major from Brooklyn named Samuel Katz, stared at him for a long moment, then laughed, not unkindly, but with the incredulity of a man who had spent months trying to locate German jet bases through careful analysis of radio intercepts and photo reconnaissance, only to have the problem solved by a lieutenant with a broken instrument. "You got lost," Katz repeated, shaking his head, "and you found what we've been looking for since February." "Yes, sir," Howell said. "Hell of a way to navigate," Katz said, and made a note in his file. But the broken compass was more than a quirk of chance. It was a symbol of something deeper, something that defined the American war effort in its final months. The ability to adapt, to improvise, to turn mistakes into opportunities. The Luftwaffe, for all its technical sophistication and tactical skill, had become rigid in its thinking, clinging to strategies that no longer worked and relying on weapons that could not be produced or fueled in sufficient numbers. The Americans, by contrast, had built a military machine that could absorb setbacks, learn from failures, and continue fighting with the flexibility that the Germans, trapped in their own declining infrastructure and ideological certainty, could not match. A broken compass in this context was not a liability. It was simply another variable in the chaotic equation of war, one that could be compensated for by the presence of so many other functioning systems. The radio that still worked, the fuel that was still sufficient, the training that taught pilots to think rather than merely follow orders. And there was something else too, something less tangible but no less important. The sound of chewing gum being cracked between teeth. It was a sound that Howell had heard 1,000 times in briefing rooms and mess halls, the idle habit of pilots waiting for missions to begin or debriefings to end. Gum was ubiquitous in the American military, handed out in ration packs, sold in PX stores, chewed incessantly by men who had nothing else to do with their mouths while their minds processed the stress of combat. It was a small thing, almost trivial, but it represented something the Germans could not replicate. The surplus capacity of a nation that could afford to ship chewing gum across an ocean, along with tanks and ammunition and aircraft and fuel, and distribute it to every soldier, every pilot, every man in uniform, as if it were as essential as the weapons they carried. German soldiers by 1945 were chewing on ersatz tobacco or sawdust bread. American soldiers were chewing Rigny spearmint. The difference was not just material, it was psychological. It was the confidence that came from knowing that your nation could supply everything you needed and more. That no single failure, not a broken compass, not a lost formation, not even a disastrous battle, could cripple the war effort, because there was always another resource, another unit, another plan. The Germans had built their war on the assumption that superior quality could defeat superior quantity. By April 1945, that assumption lay in ruins, buried beneath the wreckage of jet fighters that had never left the ground and the bodies of pilots who had never learned to fly them properly. The destruction of the hidden airfield had immediate and cascading effects on Luftwaffe operations in southern Bavaria. The Me-262 stationed there had been part of a planned counteroffensive intended to disrupt Allied bomber formations targeting the remaining industrial facilities around Munich. With those jets destroyed, the counteroffensive never materialized. The bombers flew unopposed, and the factories they targeted, plants producing ball bearings, optical equipment, and precision instruments, were reduced to rubble. The Luftwaffe attempted to relocate its remaining jets to other hidden bases, but Allied intelligence, now alert to the pattern, intensified photo reconnaissance efforts and began systematically identifying and targeting every suspected jet facility in the region. By the end of April, the number of operational Me-262s in Bavaria had dropped from an estimated 50 to fewer than 10, and those that remained were increasingly grounded by lack of fuel and spare parts. The psychological impact on German pilots was equally devastating. The Me-262 had been sold to them as a wonder weapon, a technological marvel that would turn the tide of the air war and allow Germany to regain control of its own skies. But the reality was that most Me-262 pilots spent more time hiding their aircraft from Allied fighter bombers than actually flying them in combat. The jets were fast, but they were also fragile, temperamental, and required long, smooth runways to take off and land, runways that were easy targets for attack. And even when they did get airborne, the jets faced overwhelming odds. For every Me-262 that managed to shoot down an Allied bomber, there were a dozen American fighters waiting to ambush it on its landing approach, when its speed advantage evaporated and it became as vulnerable as any other aircraft. The German pilots understood this. They were not fools, and they were not blind to the collapse happening around them. In the diary of Oberleutnant Franz Schaefer, a Me-262 pilot shot down and captured near Regensburg on April 24, 1945, there is an entry dated 3 days before his final mission. "We are told the jets will save us, but there is no fuel to fly them, no runway safe to land them, no mechanics trained to repair them. We are flying miracles built by a country that can no longer afford miracles. The Americans do not need miracles. They have 10,000 ordinary planes, and that is enough." Schaefer survived the war. His aircraft did not. It was destroyed by a P-51 Mustang flown by a pilot from Ohio, a man who had never heard of James Howell or the broken compass or the hidden airfield, but who was part of the same vast interlocking system that had made Howell's accidental discovery possible. That system, built on logistics, on redundancy, on the willingness to accept losses and replace them, was the true weapon of the American war effort. The Me-262 was faster, more advanced, more elegant, but it existed in isolation, unsupported by the infrastructure necessary to keep it in the air. The P-51, by contrast, was part of a network so dense and resilient that even its failures contributed to eventual success. This was the lesson that the Germans learned too late, that in modern industrial war, individual brilliance is less important than collective competence, and that the side with the deeper reserves of fuel, of pilots, of replacement parts, of the small comforts like chewing gum that keep men sane under stress, will outlast the side that stakes everything on a few perfect machines. By May 1945, the air war over Germany was over. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force, its remaining aircraft scattered, its pilots surrendered or dead, its airfields occupied by Allied forces. The Me-262, the jet that was supposed to change everything, had achieved a total of 542 confirmed kills against Allied aircraft. A respectable number, but nowhere near enough to affect the outcome of the war. The Americans and British, by contrast, had flown over 1.5 million combat sorties over Europe in the final year of the war, losing fewer than 10,000 aircraft, a casualty rate that, while significant, was easily absorbed by the production lines that were still churning out new planes every day. James Howell returned to the United States in July 1945. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions on April 8th, though the citation made no mention of the broken compass, referring instead to his initiative and resourcefulness in locating and reporting a high-value enemy target. He did not speak much about the war after returning home. Like many veterans, he found that the experience resisted easy explanation, that the things that had seemed important at the time, the fear, the adrenaline, the strange clarity of mind that came when everything went wrong, did not translate well into peacetime conversation. When people asked him how he had found the hidden airfield, he told them the truth, that his compass had broken, that he had gotten lost, and that he had simply flown until he saw something worth reporting. It was not a heroic story. It was not the kind of narrative that fit the popular image of the war, where brave men made brilliant top decisions and won decisive victories through skill and courage. But it was true, and in its own way, it was more instructive than any tale of heroism. Because what Howell's story revealed was not that American pilots were braver or smarter than their German counterparts, but that they fought within a system that could tolerate mistakes, that could absorb randomness, that could turn a broken compass into a strategic asset, because there were so many other working systems to compensate for the failure of any single component. The compass itself was never repaired. When Howell returned to his base after the mission, the crew chief examined it, declared it beyond salvaging, and installed the replacement. The broken unit was discarded, tossed into a bin with other damaged instruments, and eventually melted down for scrap. It left no trace, no memorial, no physical evidence that it had ever existed. But the airfield it had inadvertently revealed was photographed, cataloged, and analyzed, and the intelligence gathered from its destruction was disseminated to units across the European theater, contributing to the final dismantling of the Luftwaffe's remaining jet program. In this way, the broken compass became a kind of ghost, invisible but present, its influence rippling outward through the machinery of war long after the object itself had vanished. It was, in the end, a fitting symbol for the American approach to warfare: pragmatic, unsentimental, willing to use whatever worked and discard whatever did not, and always, always moving forward, even when the instruments said otherwise. There is a photograph taken in late April 1945 of the airfield that Howell discovered. It shows a cratered runway, twisted metal scattered across the tarmac, and the charred skeletons of Me-262s lying where they burned. In the foreground, an American soldier stands with his hands on his hips, staring at the wreckage. The photograph is grainy, black and white, and utterly without drama. There are no flames, no smoke, no visible signs of the violence that created the scene. Just destruction, rendered mundane by its completeness. This photograph, like the broken compass, tells a truth that is easy to overlook: that the outcome of the war was decided not by dramatic moments or heroic gestures, but by the accumulated weight of 10,000 small advantages: a working radio here, a full fuel tank there, a pilot who got lost but kept transmitting, a system robust enough to turn accidents into opportunities. The Germans had built faster planes and better tanks, but they had not built a system capable of sustaining those weapons under the relentless pressure of industrial attrition. And so they lost, not because they lacked courage or skill, but because they had staked their survival on the perfection of individual components rather than the resilience of the whole. The Americans, chewing their gum and flying their adequate planes and navigating with broken compasses, had understood something more fundamental: that wars are not won by the best weapons, but by the best systems. And that in the chaos of combat, where instruments fail and plans fall apart and nothing goes as expected, the side that can adapt, improvise, and continue fighting despite the failures is the side that will still be there when the smoke clears. James Howell never saw the photograph of the destroyed airfield. He never knew the exact number of jets that had been destroyed as a result of his report, never met the pilots who had flown the strike, never learned the names of the German crews who had died in the flames. He knew only that his compass had broken, that he had kept flying, and that somewhere in the process of being lost, he had contributed to the end of a war that had already been decided by forces far larger than any single man or machine. Years later, in an interview conducted for a local newspaper in 1982, Howell was asked if he had ever regretted not turning back when his compass failed. He thought about it for a moment, then shook his head. "I couldn't go back," he said. "I didn't know where back was, so I kept going forward, and it worked out." It was, in its simplicity, the perfect summary of the American war. Keep going forward, even when the instruments fail, even when the way is unclear, even when all you have to guide you is instinct and luck, and the faith that someone, somewhere, is listening to your transmissions. It was not elegant, it was not glorious, but it was enough. And in the end, enough was all that mattered.